Hello, my name is Naguura, and today I'm going to be talking about the problem with mythic raids being too difficult, possibly, and I guess solutions to that issue. Because there's been a debate on Twitter, specifically because of Zepalka, the first ones that has been nerfed numerous times at this point. And not just a little bit, but it was nerfed kind of drastically. Not just numbers, not just like the damage income and the amount of damage you need to do to the bosses, but also certain mechanics have been very drastically changed from its initial version. And people have been complaining that that is an issue. Now, there's a bunch of different sides to this argument, and I've been tweeting about it myself, but I figured that Twitter is just a platform where you can't have a proper discussion, especially when there seems to be two sides to the argument, right? One side of the player base is like a more casual side of the player base, and the other player base is more hardcore, like the Race to World First raiders and the top 10 raiding guilds or whatever. And they seem to be kind of hostile to each other almost in these kind of arguments. And I always feel like it doesn't really lead to anything to have this sort of discussion on Twitter. And that's why I was thinking I'm just gonna make this video, explain my thoughts about the whole issue, and you guys can write in the comments if you agree, if you disagree, if you have any other solutions to the issue or other thoughts that I'm maybe not thinking about. So the way I want to approach the problem is to basically find a solution that kind of works for everyone and not necessarily caters towards only one part of the player base, because I do think that there definitely are solutions that would work for everyone. Because certain people are saying that nerfing the raid this much is a problem because they have killed it in the more difficult version, so why should other people be able to play it in an easier version, right? And I understand the argument, but then at the same time, I think a lot of the players don't necessarily know that raids have been nerfed forever, right? It has always been this way, even back to like ICC or even before that. The difference was that maybe the raids haven't been nerfed as hard, and additionally, raids haven't been nerfed directly, because you can nerf the raids in two different ways. You can either make the bosses easier, or you can give the players more power, because then the bosses also become easier at the same time, right? But if the players become more power, and that's how the raid gets nerfed, it is not as obvious and people don't complain about it as much, right? Because if the raid just becomes easier for you because you get more gear and more power throughout a couple of weeks, then that is like a natural kind of progression, and it's not from one day to the other, the boss all of a sudden has 10% less HP, right? So it definitely feels more natural when bosses get nerfed through player power rather than the bosses directly getting nerfed. And additionally to the problem of the bosses directly being nerfed is the fact that it's not revertible, right? Because if a boss gets nerfed through player power, if the raid becomes stronger, then that is something you can technically remove and still play the boss in a hard version, right? You could technically take off all of your gear and still try to kill the boss. So you can make it harder on yourself if you want to. Not that many players would want to do that, but at least you would have the possibility to do so, right? And we even had achievements like that in the past, where you got certain achievements if no one died throughout the raid, like the Immortal and the Undying achievement and the Chosen achievement as well. There were these kind of things that kind of made it harder on you. And then you also had achievements where if you only had certain item level equipped, I think that was an achievement in, if I remember correctly, Ulduar, where you would get an achievement if none of the players had more item level than X, right? And that is something that I personally think is important, that you can have an achievement if you want to, like you can make it hard on yourself if you want to. But if the bosses actively get nerfed, then you cannot just press a button and it's unnerfed all of a sudden, right? It just gets nerfed for everyone and you don't have a choice to play the more difficult version. This was also very obvious in ICC, for example. In ICC, there was a buff that gave you 5%, I think 5% more damage, 5% more healing, and 5% more HP. And that buff stacked up over the weeks. But you were able to turn off the buff if you wanted to, right? So if you wanted to play the raid with 0 buffs, you could do so. You could just talk to an NPC at the start of the raid and say, hey, I don't want this buff. I want to play the harder version of the raid. And again, that does not work with direct nerfs to the bosses like we have them right now in Sepulchre of the first ones. And I think that is why some people have been complaining. I personally am also under the impression that if they nerf a raid, it should almost always come through gear and not necessarily through active nerfs. But then at the same time, I also understand that it's very difficult to nerf the raid exclusively through player power because of the way that top players and the Race to World First players are raiding nowadays. The issue is that the high-end player base, the Race to World First guilds, for example, they put so much time and effort into getting as much of an advantage as possible, as fast as possible, that they already get all of this advantage that you're supposed to get later on to nerf the raid passively, right? For example, this time around in Sepulchre of the first ones, they did so many split raids that all of the Race to World First guilds had all of their players with 4 set already, while most guilds kind of needed that set bonus as like a later power increase that happens naturally, and that kind of natural power increase didn't happen for the Race to World First guilds. They just almost immediately had it already at the start, and that created this huge problem that the bosses were supposed to be tuned for not having those kind of tier sets and the legendaries, so the Race to World First raiders have a hard time killing the bosses without it. And then afterwards, all the other like more normal guilds, they would be able to get the tier set over a couple of weeks, and then they would get the second legendary, and then that's how the raid gets nerfed through gear, right? But that obviously didn't happen because the Race to World First guilds did all of this stuff to gain an advantage already early on. Now, what is the solution to this problem? I think it's very difficult to kind of stop the Race to World First raiders to get these kind of advantages early on. And then a lot of people, I would say specifically more casual players, are basically asking Blizzard to just make the raids easier from the get-go and not care about the difficulty for the Race to World First raiders. They're basically saying, tune the raid for normal raiders, for normal mythic raiders, and if the Race to World First guilds clear the raid in one day because they're putting so much time and effort into getting advantage, well, then that's their thing, right? Like, it's only 1,000 players, or it's only 200 players or whatever that are doing this, and therefore we shouldn't care about them. We should just tune the raids for everyone else, and whatever they are doing doesn't matter. And I definitely understand the sentiment, right? Like, I 100% understand that people want this to happen because it's only a pretty small part of the player base that is putting all of this time and all of this effort into this. If Blizzard specifically has to think about them and tune rates around them early on, then that seems to be a pretty big time investment, and for such a small player base, and so on and so on. Like, I 100% get it. But I do think that there's another solution that can fix this, that does not completely remove the challenge for the super hardcore players. Because I think the Race to World First is a really big event that people love to watch, right? Even if you're not participating in the race yourself, there's lots and lots of people who just like watching it. Like, they just like to pay attention to what the guilds are doing. They're watching the broadcasts. They're keeping up with how far the guilds are. And I think that's like a big part of WoW, right? Even though it doesn't necessarily happen in the game, it happens outside of the game. It's this whole community event that a lot of people are not actively participating in, they're just watching it, right? But I do still think that it's important that it exists because the race has been a thing for so long already, and people loved to follow it even before it was streamed. People were keeping up with the race by checking where the players are, and they had these threats on MMO Champion where they would theorize who is gonna win and what they're doing and how they kill a boss and so on and so on. And I think it's this huge part of the game that I don't think should necessarily be completely like disregarded, right? I think it definitely is important for the game. It also gives lots of attention to the game as well, because I think there's going to be a lot of people that watch the race that are not even necessarily playing WoW at the moment, that maybe start playing again because they follow the race and it's so much hype, and maybe they see other people watch the race that they've played with before, and then they start playing again. Maybe it's even completely new players that have never played WoW that start playing the game because of the Race to World First, right? So I do think it's a big thing. Now, how do we solve this issue, right? Like, how do we solve the issue that obviously the Race to World First players are just on a completely other level nowadays than like a normal Mythic Raider? And this is just a fact, right? Over the years of WoW, over the years of Race to World First, I think the best guilds just became better and better and better and did more degenerate things to gain an advantage. And it's just really starting to become a much bigger problem than what it used to be, right? Because a couple of years ago, Race to World First already existed, but maybe the gap between the best guild and like a top 100 guild wasn't as big as it is now, right? And I think that is creating bigger issues now than maybe we historically have seen. And I think one of the solutions could be that they maybe divide the player base of Mythic raiding, because in the past they have already done that. In the past we only had one single raid difficulty, right? And then that worked fine for Classic and maybe also for Burning Crusade, because the players, I would say, we're all on like a somewhat similar skill level. There wasn't like a huge difference between the best guilds and like a top 1000 guild, right? They were all kind of the same skill level. But as the game progressed, the skill difference, and not just the skill difference, because a lot of people always think, oh, someone who's not Mythic raiding, they're just not as good. But that's not true. Sometimes it's also just a time investment problem, right? Sometimes people would very well be able to do Mythic, but they just don't have the time to invest into Mythic, so they can't do it, and they're just going to do Heroic instead, or maybe Normal even instead, right? And that is totally fine. And that is why Blizzard decided to create multiple difficulties of the raid, right? They just said, okay, if you want the biggest challenge, you go into Mythic. If you don't want to do the biggest challenge, you do Heroic, and otherwise you do Normal. And if you only want to see the raid and you don't care about anything else, you do LFR, right? So they created these 4 difficulties with that in mind, that there's different kinds of players that want different challenges, but also just don't have as much time and so on. And I think that was a really good decision at the start. But now I think that it kind of shifted, that certain players, or almost all of the raiders, have the Mythic difficulty as their kind of like end goal, because it drops the highest item level, right? And obviously everyone wants the highest item level. I think maybe in the past, like a couple of years ago, people were not as concerned to have the highest item level. Of course, everyone always strived to have better items. But over the course of the years, people just became, like, the whole player base became more concerned about loot and more concerned about items, right? Everyone wants to have the biggest player power and the best player power and the best items. Even just like a more casual player wants to strive for the best items. And the best items drop Mythic, right? So a lot of players feel the need to do Mythic raiding, right? Even if that content is not necessarily designed for them, at least not initially, right? Because initially, when they divided the difficulties, I think that Blizzard was thinking, oh, players who want the difficulty, they do Mythic, and people who don't want it to be as difficult, they do Normal or Heroic, right? But that's just not how it ended up being nowadays. Nowadays, everyone wants to do Mythic, not necessarily because they seek the challenge, but because it does drop the highest item level and they want the highest item level, right? And I think that is something that can be addressed, because if it's only the item level that kind of motivates people to do Mythic, then that can be changed by either making it only like a cosmetic thing, kind of like Final Fantasy XIV does with the ultimates, right? Where they're saying ultimates only drop cosmetics, but it's very difficult and your gear gets scaled and it's never going to be easier. Like, this is a challenge, do it or don't, right? But if you don't do it, you don't have a huge disadvantage with your item level, right? And I think that is right now a little bit of the issue with Mythic, because Mythic drops the highest item level and everyone kind of wants to do it. Not just people who seek the challenge, but also people who just want the items, right? And I think if you would address that issue, it would not lump so many different players together. Because right now, the people who want to do mythic raiding are all sorts of different people that have various different skill levels, various different time that they can invest, and various different motivation as well. And I think that is becoming a little bit of a problem. A variety of different players that want different things all want to do the same content, then all of a sudden that content cannot be catered to everyone at the same time anymore, right? I think that makes sense. Because if your friend who only wants to raid once a week wants to do Mythic, and then at the same time Liquid Max wants to do the same content, that's a problem, right? Because those are two completely different players. One player raids once a week, and the other player is a Race to World First player who makes a living off the Race to World First and wants to clear everything as fast as possible. So they have completely different kind of goals and completely different viewpoints, but they still want to do the same content. And how could you possibly cater that content towards everyone simultaneously when their ideas of the players that want to do the content are so vastly different, right? So that's why I'm thinking dividing Mythic, or maybe changing the incentive for that content makes sense, right? Because if you have Mythic to be only like a cosmetic kind of content, where you don't necessarily get higher item level loot, it's not like the ultimate goal for everyone to do it because it only gives you like achievements or transmogs or like a mount or whatever, then I don't think the whole player base would complain so much about it being too hard, because at that point, that's the only reason for it to exist. Because I do think things existing for a challenge is really important for the game, not just for the top 1%, right? If you think about something like the Mage Tower Challenge, a lot of people loved the Mage Tower Challenge. Why? Because the Mage Tower Challenge was very difficult, right? So why did so many people like it if they think it was too hard? It's because it's something to strive for. It's like a goal and you want to challenge yourself. I think every player, big majority of the player base that wants to get better and wants to achieve something, and I think that's the whole premise of an MMO, right? Just having goals and achieving them, that is what an MMO is about. So if there's something that is more difficult, that requires more like practice, more player skill, whatever, then it should be accessible for everyone if you want the challenge. I think that's should be the main goal for you to do the content, or to want to do the content. Because if someone doesn't care about challenging themselves and they don't want to become better, well, then they just don't do the challenge, right? And I think if that is true, if only people that want the challenge do the content, then it can specifically be catered to the player base. And now we go back to Mythic raiding, where this is not true anymore, where the people who want the challenge do Mythic, but also people who don't necessarily want the challenge, they only want the items, they also do Mythic. And that is where the problem lies, if you are following me here. And if you disagree, just let me know in the comments, right? But I think that is like the major problem that we have at the moment. It's like everyone wants to do Mythic. At the very start when it comes out, it kind of needs to be hard, because people who want the challenge, they should be happy as well. They should have a challenge, right? And then afterwards, it has to be nerfed numerous times, because there's so many other people who don't necessarily seek the challenge, they just want the items, and they need to be able to do the content as well. So making Mythic kind of like a cosmetic like difficulty that is only there for the challenge would make the player base happy. That is like the Race to World First guilds, people that seek a challenge, people that just want to progress, people that want to achieve something. And then the heroic version of the raid could be the version of the raid that drops the highest item level, right? Now, I do think that the difficulty of heroic would have to be adjusted a little bit, because I think heroic, the way it is tuned right now, might be a bit too easy if you do it in full Mythic gear, right? Like if everyone has full Mythic gear, then heroic is probably a bit too easy. But if you do heroic with full heroic gear, I don't necessarily think it would be too hard, right? So if you would remove the Mythic item level, like let's imagine Mythic item level doesn't exist. Let's imagine heroic item level is the highest item level you can get in the game, right? Then all of a sudden, I don't think heroic is maybe too easy anymore or too hard, right? I think it would be like a pretty good difficulty as the highest difficulty that drops the highest items, right? Because if you remember when heroic came out at the start, it was actually really hard. Sepulchre, the first ones. Like some people didn't even manage, a lot of guilds didn't manage to kill Anduin on heroic the first week. And a lot of people struggled even on earlier bosses as well. And even heroic jailer was a boss that was really hard. Of course, eventually became much easier when you had mythic item level gear, right? But before that, it really was kind of a fine difficulty, I think. So, yeah. Conclusion, I think dividing the player base and creating content for them specifically makes more sense. Just because I think that was the initial goal by Blizzard. That's why they created these difficulties. But it just, over the years, it just ended up not hitting the goal anymore. Like that goal that they wanted to reach by dividing the difficulties. The competitive players do Mythic, the not so competitive players do Heroic, and the others do Normal and LFR. Like that was their idea. And it ended up just not being true anymore nowadays. Like now everyone wants to do Mythic technically. And I think that has to be addressed. If that is being addressed, then I think everyone can be happy in their own kind of content and the thing that you want to do, right? I don't think you have to take away the hard content completely. I don't think you have to take away the Mythic Raid, or you have to make Mythic Raid much easier or whatever, right? You can just make sure that people who don't want the challenge also don't do the content or don't feel the need to do it, right? Because think about Mythic Plus, for example. I think Mythic Plus is a very good comparison to make my point clearer. Because Mythic Plus right now scales infinitely, right? It scales up to plus 50, plus 100, whatever, right? And people who really want the challenge, they try to push their key as high as possible. They do a plus 30 key, a plus 32 key, or whatever. But it doesn't actually give them any like item level advantage, right? Because the item level stops scaling from plus 15 onwards already. So if you do a higher key than 15, you don't gain an advantage from a player power perspective. The only advantage or the only thing you get from doing really high keys is getting certain achievements and getting the rank 1 title at the end of the season, possibly, right? And I think that is enough of an incentive for a competitive player to try and reach for it, right? There's many people who try to do high and plus, and there's many people who like doing this kind of stuff. And they do it even though there's no item advantage they're getting, right? They still do it. And I think the same thing could be applied to raiding as well. Just give the people who want the challenge a challenge, but don't necessarily put an item advantage behind it to make sure that people who don't want the challenge, that they don't feel the need to do it, right? Because if you're a normal player, you're not going to think, oh, I need to do a plus 30 key. Oh, I need to do a plus 32, whatever, right? You're not thinking that if you don't care about the challenge. Because at that point, you can just stop at plus 15, right? You can say, oh, I'm doing a plus 15, or I'm doing a plus 20 to get the portal, or I'm doing this to get the achievement, or whatever, and then you stop if that's your only goal. If your only goal is item level or certain achievements, then you will stop at that. You won't go further. And yeah, in my mind, solving this big issue for raiding would solve all of the issues that people have been talking about all over Twitter, you know? But yeah, what do you think? Like, do you think there's another solution to this? Do you think there's something else they could do? One more thing I wanted to say is that a lot of people have also been saying that raiding is just not fun anymore for them. And some people were saying it's because of the difficulty of Mythic. Like, let's assume they make this like cosmetic only Mythic difficulty, right? I still also think that the raiding experience for players that don't want to raid super hardcore should still be improved on, right? Because a lot of people don't necessarily complain about Mythic raiding existing at all, but they just think that their own raiding experience has not been the greatest. And I 100% agree with you. I think that raiding in World of Warcraft, especially for not so hardcore players, should be improved upon, or it could be improved upon with multiple things. For example, I think the raid size is something that they should look into a bit more. We already have flexible raid sizes, right, in normal mode and heroic. And I do think that that maybe could be addressed even more, that the tuning of certain bosses is not much harder or easier with a certain number of raiders. And I also think if heroic becomes the hardest difficulty for the highest item level, like if heroic drops the highest item level, and heroic having different raid sizes would kind of solve a lot of the issues of guilds disbanding. Because I saw a lot of people complain, oh, my mythic guild disbanded, I like to raid, but the mythic, like the guilds don't stick, and people just like it's too difficult and it's too much of a time commitment and so on. And I 100% agree. And I think the solution that I'm suggesting, with heroic being the hardest difficulty that drops the highest item level, would also technically fix the issue of you needing of guilds disbanding and stuff, because I think a big reason why guilds are disbanding is because of the player size that you need for raiding mythic. You need 20 players. And I know in the past you needed a lot more. I know you needed like 40 in the past, or like 25, 30 and so on. But I think nowadays, especially if you compare it to other MMOs, the amount of players required for mythic raiding is just too high nowadays for how people play MMOs nowadays, right? If you look at Lost Ark, Final Fantasy XIV, all of their raiding systems are really nicely done, I think. And a lot of people like raiding in these games. And a big part of it, in my opinion, is because you only need 8 or 4 players even sometimes, right? Only needing 8 players is such a big advantage, because then you don't necessarily need to have a guild, right? Maybe you just have a bunch of friends that you want to raid with. Maybe you can have flexible raid hours. Maybe you skip a raid 1 week and do it on a different day, right? And you have so many more options with your raiding times if the raid size is smaller, because if you need 20 people, you kind of need to stick to certain times. You need a guild. You can't just randomly say, oh, I want to do Mythic one today, and then you find a guild. Like, that doesn't really work, right? So smaller raid size, which would be possible with heroic, right? With the flexible raiding size in normal and in heroic that we have. If that is like the ultimate raid that drops the highest item level, heroic that is, then I think some of these guild issues would be resolved as well, because you don't need 20 players anymore, right? You can do smaller raids, you can do bigger raids, you can do whatever you choose to do, and just go for it. So I don't know, that was a long video with a lot of thoughts. Just let me know what you think. I just strive for a solution that kind of makes everyone happy, because I personally am a more like hardcore player. I'm not a world first raider anymore, right? But I still like having a challenge. But then at the same time, I also want other people that don't seek a challenge to have fun in the game, right? I totally understand when people complain about this, right? I 100% get it. And that's why I'm looking for a solution that kind of solves the problem for both sides and for everyone. Because I just don't see that we have to take away the most difficult raids and make it easier because others have an issue with it, right? Because, again, I understand the problem, but I just think that there's more solutions to this that work for everyone, right? All right, sorry for the ramble, but I hope you understood what I was trying to say. And let me know your thoughts. Let me know, what do you think? Is there another solution? Do you think the problem that I am pointing out is not the problem at all? Do you think they should be doing something else? Do you think there's another issue that I'm not really seeing, or an issue that I'm not thinking about? Just let me know. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Make sure you like the video if you enjoyed my rambling. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and you'll see me on my Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/Naguura as well. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice rest of your day, and goodbye.